Neil Kinnock, looking back to 1979, many historians and commentators now see it as a watershed in British politics, the beginning of a new era which would change Britain. But I wonder, did it feel that way at the time?
For me, to some extent, mainly because I'd examined what Sir Keith Joseph and the Centre for Policy Studies and Mrs. Thatcher had been saying over the period since she became the leader of the Conservative Party. And my feelings, which I expressed wherever anybody would listen, was that they did intend to fundamentally destroy the general, broad, consensual agreement between parties that had existed since 1945, since the end of the war, and to replace it with a sort of cross between fairly rabid Republican attitudes with a little splash of Sozialmarktwirtschaft, the social market economy, put in for good measure. And so I was fearful of what the effect of the application of Mrs. Thatcher's policies would be, even before it was called Thatcherism. And unfortunately, a lot of my worst anticipations were fulfilled.
You say she destroyed this consensus. Of course, on her first day in power, she stood outside Number 10 and she said, "Where there is discord, may we bring harmony."
Yes, I think that either demonstrated an unconscious sense of humour, which is unsuspected in Mrs. Thatcher, or at that time she really did think, as Sir Keith Joseph would have told her, that the pursuit of the policies that she wanted to employ would actually bring a more serene society. She may well have believed that at the time, but within a relatively short time afterwards, I'm certain that an intelligent woman like Mrs. Thatcher would have realized that discord was exactly what she was propelling in the application of the policies, and indeed the way in which they were applied, accompanied by the rhetoric with which they were delivered.
I suppose her supporters would say that given the state of Britain's economy in 1979, she needed to pursue a very tough-minded agenda. It was a market economy agenda, as you said, and therefore that would upset a lot of people, but it's what was needed at that time. That's the defence of her.
Yes, but they aren't really giving proper attention to the factual record. I mean, it wasn't tough-mindedness that brought about the destruction of 25% of the manufacturing capacity of British industry, or sent the pound hurtling upwards on the back of very high interest rates and the oil to make export life almost unsustainable, or indeed, over the period of Mrs. Thatcher's rule, actually increased the tax burden on the British people above what she'd inherited from the Callaghan government. Now, any objective assessment of that, I know I'm in most respects not objective about Mrs. Thatcher. She was my partisan opponent, and a very fierce one at that. But the facts speak for themselves, and they do demonstrate a fall in investment, an increase in poverty with all of the immense costs that go with that, an increase in the tax burden, great difficulty with the balance of payments, and a huge loss of manufacturing industry. Tough-mindedness would have been propelling higher standards of management in both the public and private sectors. It would have meant an entirely new training and technical education regime, and a very firm concentration on stimulating marketable research and development. That was essential in the 1980s. That isn't what happened.
You've been talking mainly about the private sector. Of course, she believed, and Keith Joseph believed, that creating a stronger economy meant tackling problems in the public sector. From their point of view, the biggest problem was that it was too big. It absorbed too big a proportion of the national cake. What was your view at the time?
I had a degree of sympathy with that, because back in the 1970s I'd made arguments for very significant changes, for instance, in the British steel industry. and elsewhere, which provided major changes in the employment practices in return for the essential modernizing investment that should take place. Indeed, I got into trouble with my own Labour government for advocating such policies. The question was always not whether change needed to take place. I don't think there was any real difference, certainly not as far as I was concerned, of that. It was how it was done. And it is truly said, of course, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, but throwing them against the wall isn't a very good way of breaking eggs in order to make an omelette. And there was a lot of throwing eggs against the wall, confrontational, very direct, no effort at negotiation, no commitment of fresh investment in exchange for practices which had to change. And even the privatization process advertised as a way of creating people's capitalism, of spreading share ownership, a lot of other objectives that any sensible person could basically agree with. We knew at the outset, which is why we opposed it, and certainly that foreknowledge came to be fulfilled, that it would actually mean the exchange of ownership by the state for substantial hegemony by a very small number of institutional investors rather than people's capitalism. And that's what it turned out to be.
Confrontational, you say, and she certainly was confrontational towards the trade union. She made no bones about that right from the beginning.
Yeah, she could afford to, you see, against the background of 3.5 to 4 million unemployed. People say that it was the application of Thatcherism that brought changes in labour market practices and in attitudes towards industrial relations and employment in the United Kingdom. And I guess as a context that probably holds some water. But the biggest, much more influential change in circumstances was mass unemployment and the monstrous insecurity that went with it. Because if you've got 4 million people in unemployment, you've got 10 million people worrying about their jobs. And people in that situation tend to be rather conformist and deferential. And the question then is, are they essentially more productive? Do we secure a reduction in marginal costs? Does Britain become more competitive? And the answer to all those questions was no.
What about Britain's role in the world? Now, her admirers say that we were a much stronger country under her leadership, that the Soviets dubbed her the Iron Lady. What do you think?
Unfortunately, the period of Mrs. Thatcher's rule was largely characterized by quite unprecedented deference towards the United States, particularly when Mr. Reagan was the president, a contempt almost for the Commonwealth, which wasn't healthy, especially at a time when so much hinged on attitudes towards development and the hoped-for advancement of democratic practices in many countries in the Commonwealth. And then, of course, the attitude towards the European Union meant that there was an opportunity every few months for theatrical grandstanding, which didn't actually win too many friends or influence people. In international terms, I give one substantial credit to Mrs. Thatcher, and that is completing the job started by Jim Callaghan of trying to get a rebate to properly recognize the imbalance between Britain's contributions to the European Union and Britain's objective economic standing in the European Union. And she did succeed in getting that rebate, and that rebate continues to exist. Otherwise, the story was largely one of alienation mixed with some ridicule and a degree of admiration for style, which contrasted strongly with a lack of admiration for substance. And that was what Britain really couldn't afford in that crucial, determining decade of the 1980s, when the Cold War was coming to an end, when Gorbachev and Reagan were meeting in Reykjavik, when eventually the wall came down. There wasn't sufficient flexibility, if you like, or imagination in foreign policy to have secured advances and additional influence which justifiably could and should have been Britain's.
Just looking at her record overall, domestically and internationally, do you believe fundamentally she got it wrong? Or in hindsight, was there anything fundamentally which, with the benefit of hindsight, you think now she got right?
I don't think there was anything fundamentally right. I don't think she started out intentionally, obviously, to be fundamentally wrong. I think that the philosophical conviction that she was awarded, if you like, or brought into by Keith Joseph, who was an intelligent and very decent man, really was pretty benign. And they didn't really calculate what in the real world the outcomes were. As they practiced that, of course, Mrs. Thatcher generated enormous unpopularity. If you look at the situation in, say, 1981, that was self-evident, including in her own party. And then she had to say, the lady's not for turning. Then, civil war in the Labour Party, gradual upturn in the economy, and the real war in the Falklands did alter things, and that was really the dawn of Thatcherism. A term had hardly been used before that. And it's from there on that, compounding the problems that were generated by budgetary errors and by not taking account of the impact of the oil on the economy and by running a very high interest regime, all those difficulties are then compounded by stylistic and policy changes that produced the fundamental flaws. And it was extremely disadvantageous to the United Kingdom and very divisive as well. I regret to have to say this. I would love to be able to allocate some credit over an extended and in some ways distinguished period of office by Britain's first woman Prime Minister, but I'd just be dishonest if I was to try, even with the benefit of hindsight, to say that there was something fundamentally beneficial and fundamentally progressive and advantageous from that period. I can't convince myself on objective grounds that that was the case.
Just finally, on a personal level, even though you feel she got it quite wrong on most things, did you admire her determination? I mean, there you were twice a week facing her across the dispatch box.
In a sense, yes, but the really tough people that I've met in my life, in all parts of society and at all levels, are distinguished by the fact that they never talk about it. And Mrs. T used to go on and on and on about how tough she was, how resilient she was. And that always diminished my regard for her, I must say.